Our third speaker is Gabriele. Schwab is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Irvine. She holds appointments in the departments of comparative literature, anthropology, English and European languages and studies. She received her PhD in literary studies and critical theory at the University of Constance in 1976, and another PhD in psychoanalysis from the New Center of Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles in 2009. Her research interests include critical theory, psychoanalysis, trauma studies, literature and anthropology, and 20th and 21st century comparative literatures. Her monographs in English include Subjects Without Selves, The Mirror and the Killer Queen, Hunting Legacies, Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma. And this book is going to be reconsidered today, and her title is Ghostly Transferences, Revisiting Haunting Legacies. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, let me be the last one to add my thanks to Nayat and the Ranting Foundation for bringing us together here for this truly amazing conference. And this was also probably the best organized conference I have attended in my long career. And without Nayat's and her many assistants and translators' help, this would not have been possible. I also want to thank Aisha for her hospitality. I'm so happy I finally met her, and you'll understand a little bit more why when I continue. Nayat asked me to speak about my book, Haunting Legacies, which some of you have read, and that was probably the reason for the invitation. So here we go. Haunting Legacies is unlike any of my other books because it is, in a sense, motivated by my own history. If I would pick a date for its origin, it would be September 11 of 2001. That day, we buried my mother in a small Black Forest cemetery exactly at the time of the attacks on the World Trade Center. That very September, I also started training as a psychoanalyst at the Southern California Psychoanalytic Institute. During my first session, my analyst asked, if you think of something you would like to achieve in this analysis, what would it be? Without thinking twice, I answered to write a book about what it meant growing up in Germany after World War II. I truly surprised myself with this answer. I thought I had given up this idea a long time ago because I couldn't face the intense emotional involvement and the many traps of writing on the Holocaust. But there was my unconscious speaking, and I owed it to my analysis to listen. So beyond this personal history, I also wanted the book to become a scholarly exploration of a range of theoretical issues. And these include, first, transgenerational trauma and transgenerational writing about haunting histories. Second, the transgenerational legacy of perpetrators and perpetrator nations. So in a way, I'm not talking here today about perpetrators, but about their legacy and its transmission to their children. And I'm doing so in comparison with the transgenerational legacy of victims. The focus of my book, in other words, is second-generation narratives from both the children of victims and the children of perpetrators. And then the third would be writing about a violent past from a present and future-oriented perspective. And this also meant considering intersections of the history of the Holocaust and World War II with other histories of violence and trauma, such as, for example, colonialism and slavery, the Armenian trauma and that of apartheid in South Africa, and also disappearances in the Americas, to name just a few that I deal with in the book. Now, let me begin by adding a few connections to Armenian history. Among the many responses to Haunting Legacies, which included deeply personal ones, two were from descendants of survivors of the Armenian genocide. One of them is my student, Karin Yalatyan, who came to work with me on transgenerational trauma in Armenian literature and film. He had read Haunting Legacies, and that's why he came to work with me at UC Irvine. The other is Arlene Avakian, whom many of you know. One day she walked up to me in a local coffee house and said she recognized me from the photo on the back cover of Haunting Legacies. Then she added, "I'm here for a week and I want to cook for you because your book made such a deep impact on me." And those of you who have read Arlene's book know how important cooking for someone is for Arlene. This was the beginning of a friendship and many exchanges about our work. I read Lion Woman's Legacy and recently the manuscript of Mirroring Lives Across the Armenian-Turkish Divide, Conversations on Gender, Race, and Genocide between Arlene Avakian, Fethiye Çetin, and Ayşe Gül Altinay, who are here, the last two. I was deeply moved by this difficult conversation between three women of such diverse yet entangled backgrounds. Arlene is Armenian-American, Fethiye Armenian-Turkish. Both are descendants of Armenian survivors who, because they do not share a language, depend on Ayşe, their Turkish friend, as a translator. Ayşe, in turn, is deeply affected by her own legacies of the violent Turkish-Armenian history. The conversations are a veritable testimony to the healing power of transgressing the boundaries of historical divides across generations. Mirroring Lives resonates so deeply with concerns I had struggled with in Haunting Legacies that I was more than happy to accept Arlene's invitation to write a preface. Perhaps most importantly, the stories of Arlene's and Fethiye's grandmothers inspired me to think about my own grandmother's story. I realized that the reason why my grandmother did not play a prominent role in Haunting Legacies was her profound silence. This omission is all the more strange because traumatic silences are so crucial in my theoretical reflections in Haunting Legacy. And this is just yet another example why many of these processes happen at the unconscious level. It literally didn't occur to me that my grandmother's silence was a traumatic silence that was a perfect illustration of my theoretical argument. It took the detour through reading Mirroring Lives to understand that. Because my grandmother did not tell me her story firsthand, I had not given her a voice in my book. So today, I would like to open with the legacy my grandmother left me. And I should perhaps say that in contrast to my father, about whom I write in Haunting Legacies, my grandmother was actually an anti-Nazi, but she nonetheless belonged to the perpetrator nation. But I should then also add that as a child, the transgenerational legacy I received in black and white, so to speak, was that all Germans were evil. Only as an adult did I learn to differentiate about Germans, including my father's legacy on the one hand and my mother's side's legacy on the other. So my earliest memories of my grandmother were from before the age of 4, when she was my primary caretaker. I remember her as a silent woman, always dressed in black because she was in mourning. She hardly ever spoke except to give directions. Eat, don't touch the stove, don't run. She always looked sad and often cried silent tears. Or she sighed. I vividly remember her sighs that came from deep within. While she went about her daily chores, I was just orbiting around her like a satellite circling a grieving moon. As far back as I can remember, I wanted to make her feel better. Why are you crying, Oma? Please don't cry. I didn't know then why she was crying. Sometimes when I begged her to stop, she would say, "Come, I'll read you a story." Then she pulled a chair to the window, set me on her lap, and read from the only book we had, Grimm's Fairy Tales, The Frog Prince, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, The Seven Brothers. These readings times formed our intimate connection because they brought my grandmother alive. She took care of me and later my 3 siblings until she died in her early 80s when I was 18 years old. She had lost her husband to an injury incurred in World War I when a bomb exploded next to him on the battlefield. He was saved, but the shrapnel had lodged deep inside his bones, poisoning him slowly until he died many years later, leaving my grandmother to raise my mother and her 2 older brothers. After coming back from the war, my grandfather had worked as an accountant in a Jewish law firm, and my family on my mother's side had many Jewish friends. They kept their friendship alive during the Nazi regime. Then in World War II, my grandmother lost her firstborn son and her only grandchild, the infant brother I never knew. Her son had been a school teacher who had applied to teach in Ecuador because he didn't want to live in Nazi Germany. When the war broke out, he returned to take my grandmother with him to live in Quito. Instead, he was instantly drafted and killed a few months later in battle near Stalingrad. Not long after, the legendary air raid on Freiburg completely destroyed my family's house. My grandmother fled through the burning city with my mother, who carried her infant son in a backpack. A few months later, he died a miserable death from smoke poisoning. I was born during the famine years after the war in the small village where my family had found refuge. In high school, I went through boxes of old family letters and found one from a Jewish family, the Feits, who had fled to Brazil and sent my family care packages during the post-war famine. "You never have to thank us," one letter said. "You were the only people who supported us during the horrible Nazi years. Helping you survive the famine is the least we can do." To this day, my body remembers excruciating hunger. From stories, I know that my grandmother knitted day and night to exchange sweaters or mittens for a little bit of food. She had lost almost everything and had a hard time rebuilding her life. She never made new friends. No wonder she cried and cried. No wonder she mourned in silence. Grieving her entire life, she never truly healed. I loved her deeply because she was the only one who was never cruel to me. Part of the legacy she left me, I now think, was to learn to listen to and translate silences. Perhaps this is why I became not only a literary critic, but also a therapist. But my grandmother also left me another, more ambivalent legacy. She made me afraid of being weak and vulnerable. I never wanted to become like her. The two wars had broken her. Perhaps this is why I learned to hide my own vulnerabilities, often even from myself, and why I felt such an urge to try to heal people. There is still a little girl inside me who tries to make up for the sad fact that she could never help her grandmother, let alone heal her. Let me now add a few theoretical reflections about these haunting legacies, starting with a quote from Nicholas Abraham, "The Shell and the Kernel." "It is the children's or descendants' lot to objectify these buried tombs through diverse species of ghosts. What comes back to haunt are the tombs of others." This phrase raises the question of how both victims and perpetrators pass on the ineradicable legacies of violent histories through generations. The transmission of violent legacies by far exceeds the passing on of historical knowledge or even of personal stories. What I call haunting legacies are things hard to recount or even to remember, forms of violence that hold an unrelenting grip on memory, yet are deemed unspeakable. The psychic core of violent histories includes what has been repressed or buried in unreachable psychic recesses. The legacies of violence not only haunt the actual victims, but are passed on through the generations. Abraham envisions a crypt in which people bury unbearable memories of losses or injuries incurred during violent histories. It is as if in this psychic tomb they harbor an undead ghost, or as feminist critic Diana Fass argues in Identification Papers, the person who refuses to mourn becomes like the living dead. Haunting legacies draws on literary texts, memoirs, films, and occasionally my own memories of growing up in post-war West Germany. My generation's emotional involvement with the Holocaust has to a large extent been mediated and shaped by literature. As Shoshana Fellman and Dori Laub argue, quote, "Art inscribes what we do not yet know of our lived historical relations to events of our times." Christopher Bollas calls this form of knowing unthought knowledge, And I'm tracing such knowledge at both a personal, cultural, and intercultural level. In this vein, I look at literature less as a tool for acquiring knowledge than as a transformational object that changes its readers by involving them emotionally. In this context, the psychoanalytic concept of transference is crucial. In representing the Holocaust, Dominique Lacapra writes, quote, "The Holocaust presents the historian with transference in the most traumatic form conceivable, but in a form that will vary with the difference in subject position. Whether the historian is a survivor, a relative of survivors, a former Nazi, a former collaborator, a relative of former Nazis or collaborators, a younger Jew or German, or a relative outsider will make a difference, even in the meaning of statements that may be formally identical. Certain statements or even entire orientations may be appropriate for someone in a given subject position, but not in others." Like Lacapra, Eric Sandner insists on the importance of forms of writing violent history that reach beyond positivist accounts of historical facts. One can acknowledge the historical facts of the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide, for example, and yet disavow its existential and experiential impact. This is a crucial point regarding the infamous silencing of the Holocaust in post-war Germany. The facts were not hidden. Most Germans of my generation learned about the Holocaust in their early teens in high school through Alain René's documentary Night and Fog. In shock, we watched the graphic images and they remained burned in our memories. And yet, I would later realize the silence had not been broken. We had nobody with whom to process what we had seen. Silencing in Germany was not withholding of facts. It was caused by the absence of any kind of emotional engagement. What we are faced then is the question of transgenerational memory. How do children of parents who lived through violent histories remember events they do not experience themselves? Marion Hirsch coined the term post-memory. While those who actually live through the violence are left with gaps, holes, distortions, second generations receive traumatic memories secondhand. They need to patch the history together. They have never lived with props, photographs, stories, and I would add, silences, grief, rage, despair, or sudden unexplainable shifts in moods handed down to them by those who bring them up. They become the recipients not only of their parents' lived memories, but also of their somatic memories. Children of traumatized parental generations become avid readers of silences and memory traces, hidden in a face that is frozen in grief, a forced smile, an unmotivated flare-up of rage, or a chronic depression like my grandmother's described earlier. I skip a little. Facing violent histories and mourning its victims is a task the descendants of both victims and perpetrators must take over. While the two groups tend to perform this task in isolation from each other, building bridges across the divide between victims and perpetrators reaches a step further. This is exactly, by the way, the function of works like the conversations between Arlene Fettier and Ise in Mirroring Lives. We also need to build bridges to other histories of violence. What is the impact of a specific history of violence on other histories and on both the collective and individual memory of violence? In Multidirectional Memory, Michael Rosberg calls for a theory able to account for the productive intercultural dynamic of memory. Is it possible, I ask, that via transgenerational memories and narratives, descendants of perpetrators can become allies in a struggle against violence and oppression? Can the shock of recognizing the atrocities committed by one's own people prepare the ground for potential alliances? In Germany, for example, the encapsulated effective knowledge of the Holocaust was reawakened collectively during the student revolution of the 60s and 70s. Political struggles took up the issue of fascism and Holocaust within the larger and more global civil rights struggles at the time. In many respects, it was easier for my generation to focus on protests against the Shah, the Vietnam War, the worldwide movements of decolonization, solidarity committees for Angela Davis and Leonard Peltier, or the Chilean refugees, than to address the Holocaust directly. It is not that we ignored the Holocaust. We even accused the parental generation. Nonetheless, the focus of our debates and struggles was in the present, and I would insist that was not just defensively so. So it's not just a cover-up. To read such displacement according to a simple logic of cover-up or substitutions ignores the complexities and fundamental ambivalence of memory work. Memory work can perform a double function and go in both directions, from the present to the past and from the past to the present. Memory work that is displaced onto other violent histories can address the traces of past injuries and bring them into the present in order to fight against violence in the here and now. This is why transference is so crucial in engagements with violent histories, especially the conflicted transference that occurs between descendants of victims and perpetrators. A theory of transferential memory is more attuned than an identitarian memory politics to the increasingly global interdependency of violence, war, and genocidal or environmentally destructive politics. The encounter with new violent histories always operates via the recall of earlier histories, not only cognitively, but also affectively and experientially. Finally, this awareness may help to address Judith Butler's question, how we might respond effectively to suffering at a distance. Often it is through the detour of displaced yet related memories of violence that social injustice can be addressed on a more encompassing scale. This, I think, is one of the most important goals of gatherings like the one at this conference. After all, to conclude with a phrase from Mirroring Lives, probably most of us have come together in the aftermath of great losses. Thank you.